Young and the Restless spoilers. Sienna had stopped measuring time the normal way somewhere between the first drug blackout and the second time she woke with her tongue thick and her limbs too heavy to lift. Because clocks meant nothing in a place designed to erase her sense of choice. What mattered was the pattern. When Matt's steps appeared outside the door, when the cheap light flickered, when the air went stale enough that breathing felt like swallowing dust, when her own body began to feel unfamiliar, as if it belonged to the bed more than it belonged to her. She knew something else too, something colder and more clinical than fear, a knowledge that arrived in fragments and then formed a brutal sentence in her mind. She was running out of time. Whether it was the dosage, the dehydration, the internal injury from being handled too roughly, or the slow poisoning of stress, her body was sending signals she could no longer dismiss. And if she wanted a future at all, she had to construct it with mathematics rather than hope. That was why she called Matt in. Not because she trusted him, and not because she believed she could soften him with pity, but because she finally understood the only language he still responded to, leverage that felt personal. When he came into the room, the smugness on his face was almost automatic now, the practiced superiority of a man trying to convince himself that he was still in control of something. Sienna forced herself to sit up, forced her breathing to remain even, forced her eyes to hold steady on his, and then delivered the kind of information that could rewire any predator's instinct in a single second. She told him she was pregnant. Even for Matt, even for a man who treated human beings like variables, the claim landed with a jolt. Because pregnancy was not a threat you could easily outsource or solve with a single decision. It was a complication that grew louder every day, a physical timeline that did not care about his plans. Sienna insisted she needed proof, not for him but for herself, and demanded a test. Matt hesitated, suspicious as always, because he had long ago stopped believing in anything that came from another person's mouth. But he also carried the kind of arrogance that made him think he could handle whatever result appeared. He returned with a pregnancy test like it was a prop in a sick performance, and Sienna watched him watch her as she took it. Both of them trapped in a moment where the future could split into multiple ugly roads. When the result appeared, unmistakable, to lines that did not negotiate, a silence expanded in the room as if the motel itself had tightened its grip. The shift in Matt's expression was subtle, not tenderness, but calculation, because even a man with nothing left can still be terrified of losing the one thing he never expected to have. Yet the question arrived instantly, sharpening the air like a blade. Whose baby was it? Sienna understood that Matt's mind would travel first to suspicion, to the assumption that she was performing a trick, because he could not imagine a world where a woman in his custody still possessed an independent truth. She also understood the cruel logic she was forced to use. If she wanted a chance to survive, the most strategic answer was the one that tethered her life to his ego, his legacy, his sense of ownership, so she implied the baby could be his. She watched him stiffen, watched disbelief harden into fury, because his memory of their last intimacy was not vague, and Matt was not the kind of man who forgot a detail that might affect his power. They had not been together in a long time, long enough that the timing made the claim feel like a joke, and the humiliation of even entertaining it sparked something violent in him. He accused her internally of manipulation, of inventing miracles like a con artist. And his rage surged because she was forcing him to confront a possibility he could not control, that she might be carrying a child that belonged to someone else. A child whose existence would tie him forever to the Newmans whether he wanted it or not. Still, a tiny crack of uncertainty appeared in him, because biology is a ruthless equalizer and the timing of bodies is not always convenient. And Matt could not fully dismiss the possibility that the child might, against reason, against memory, still be his. That was the terrifying part for Sienna, that she could see him balancing between two impulses, one that wanted to erase the complication by erasing her, and another that wanted to possess the complication so completely that it became his new reason to exist. She leaned into that crack, not with softness but with precision, framing the pregnancy as a fact that would have consequences if he handled it wrong. Consequences that would follow him beyond borders, beyond bank accounts, beyond escape plans, because a dead pregnant woman was not just a disappearance. It was a scandal, a headline, an investigation that could be weaponized by people far more ruthless than he was. The more she pushed, the more Matt's control fractured, because he hated being forced into caution, hated any situation where the simple solution risked turning into a permanent trap. What began as a standoff became a violent clash of wills, their conflict escalating into something raw and combustible, Sienna fighting for her life with the only tools she had left. Matt fighting to preserve the illusion that he was still the author of this story. He paced, he threatened, he hovered too close, the kind of physical intimidation meant to make her shrink, but she refused. Because she knew that shrinking was how people died quietly in places like this. She made him confront every angle. If the baby was his, killing her meant killing his own blood. If the baby was not his, keeping her alive meant he was protecting the evidence of her connection to someone else. If he released her, he lost leverage. If he kept her, he risked the child becoming a liability he could not manage. The arguments collided in the air like sparks, and for the first time since the kidnapping began, Matt's certainty did not look invincible. It looked desperate, like a man clinging to a steering wheel even as the road vanished beneath him. In the middle of that storm, the unspoken name that haunted both of them swelled until it felt like a third presence in the room, Noah. Because while Matt tried to convince himself he was the center of the universe, Sienna knew Noah was out there somewhere, day and night searching, refusing to accept that love could be a trap. Refusing to accept that she might not be a damsel waiting to be rescued but a person fighting in the dark. And that belief, Noah's belief, was both her hope and her curse, because it meant he would not stop, and it meant Matt would eventually feel cornered enough to do something irreversible. Noah, meanwhile, lived in a state of constant vigilance that exhausted everyone around him, because grief was not even allowed to become grief yet. It remained suspended as dread. A long inhale that never reached release. He watched doors. He listened for phones. He replayed every interaction with Sienna as if memory could turn into a map, as if one overlooked detail could reveal where she was hidden. Sharon tried to anchor him, tried to pull him back from the edge of self-destruction, but he kept returning to the same conviction like a prayer. Sienna loved him. Sienna needed him. Sienna was not part of Matt's game. The romantic certainty that should have been beautiful became dangerous because it made him predictable, and predictable people become targets. Nick saw that and reacted the only way he knew, by tightening his control, by turning protection into authority, demanding patience, demanding obedience, insisting that the plan must unfold exactly as he designed it. Sharon pushed back, not because she didn't love Nick, but because she understood the cost of his certainty. Understood that Nick's instinct to handle it often meant he would bulldoze anyone who hesitated, then call it love afterward. Their conflict simmered through every conversation, Sharon warning that Matt was unstable, that pushing him could provoke violence. Nick refusing to accept that caution should be allowed to dictate terms when his family's life was on the line. When Nick said he wouldn't stop until Matt was taken down, Sharon heard Victor's voice in it. That inherited arrogance that insisted the Newmans were entitled to control the outcome simply because they had always controlled outcomes before. Nick would rather risk everything than admit that this situation was not just dangerous but unpredictable, and Sharon feared that unpredictability was exactly what would destroy them. Yet Nick kept moving, pushing forward with Victor in the shadows, father and son shaping a response that blended strategy with vengeance, because for the Newmans, eliminating a threat was never just about safety. It was about restoring dominance. Victor's involvement made it colder, sharper, more efficient, because Victor did not treat Matt like a human being. He treated him like a pest that had wandered too close to his property. Nick told himself that partnering with Victor was necessary, but somewhere deep down he also knew he was choosing the comfort of certainty over the discomfort of Sharon's warnings. Because Sharon's warnings forced him to face the possibility that love did not guarantee victory, and Nick could not tolerate that thought. In parallel, the rest of Genoa City continued to rearrange itself around secret agendas. as if the universe was conspiring to make sure no one had the luxury of focusing on one crisis at a time. Billy, still convinced that technology would determine who lived at the top of the city's food chain, leaned on Phyllis in a way that revealed his own desperation. Because he understood that without her hacking genius, he and Jack were fighting Victor with dull knives. Phyllis, humiliated by Jack's dismissal but energized by the chance to reinsert herself as indispensable, began moving pieces again with the hunger of someone who refused to be reduced to an afterthought. Her so-called loyalty to Jack was not sentimental. It was transactional, a temporary alignment that served her long-term goal of returning to a throne she believed she deserved. She plotted to align with Kane, to turn the stolen AI program into a weapon against Victor. And in her mind, reclaiming power was not revenge, it was justice. That meant people would be used, alliances would be feigned, and if necessary, friendships would be sacrificed. Because Phyllis had always believed that survival belonged to the ones willing to do what others wouldn't. Over all of it, Michael moved like a man walking a tightrope over fire, pretending to be Victor's loyal soldier while quietly preparing betrayal. Because stealing the AI program back required not just access, but the illusion of devotion. Victor praised him, rewarded him, gave him trust that felt like a warm coat and a noose at the same time. And Michael felt the guilt of deception tighten even as confidence whispered that the plan could work if he stayed clean. Nikki, too, carried secrets like fragile explosives, preparing to update Jack with information that could either fortify him or ruin him. And the question of whether she would reveal Michael's role in warning Victor about Jabba's protections hung like a threat over every future conversation. And then, as if Genoa City demanded one more shadow for the new year, Mariah's old terror stirred again, the psychic contamination of Ian Ward crawling back into her thoughts as 2026 approached. Reminding everyone that some villains didn't need to hold you hostage with ropes. They could do it with memory and obsession alone. Back in that motel room, Sienna's claim of pregnancy became the first thing Matt couldn't simply crush with intimidation, because it forced him into uncertainty. And uncertainty was the one sensation he could not endure. He went from mocking disbelief to paranoid interrogation, from pacing to sudden stillness, as if his mind were flipping through outcomes at a speed his conscience couldn't process. The idea that Sienna might be using the baby as a lie to buy time enraged him, but the idea that she might be telling the truth frightened him even more, because it meant he was no longer just holding Sienna. He was holding a future that could implicate him in ways he couldn't erase. If Noah was the father, then Sienna's survival became a ticking time bomb that would detonate inside the Newman family, tying Noah to her permanently, ensuring that even if Matt escaped the country, the story would continue without him, a legacy of his failure. If Matt was the father, then the situation became even more grotesque, because it would tether him to his own crime, transforming his victim into the mother of his child, forcing him to confront a version of himself that was not just a villain, but a creator of life in the midst of destruction. That contradiction made him furious, and fury made him reckless. Their argument escalated into a brutal psychological war, each of them trying to force the other into a corner. Sienna using the pregnancy as a shield and a spear at once. Matt using fear as his last remaining currency. He demanded certainty where none could exist yet. He demanded answers that only time could provide. He threatened to make decisions quickly precisely because time would reveal the truth, and truth was what he could not control. Sienna, sensing the danger, recalibrated again, recognizing that her pregnancy was not a guaranteed salvation, but a volatile match that could ignite Matt's worst impulses. She tried to steer him toward the one path that kept her alive, emphasizing that the money from Nick was still coming, that the deal still mattered, that he could still win, that he could still disappear with wealth and power if he acted smart instead of emotional. But Matt's emotions were no longer normal emotions. They were the disordered impulses of a man who had lost everything and decided the only way to feel alive was to decide who else got to keep living. And somewhere beyond the motel walls, the ripples of this secret began to press toward collision because Noah's devotion was pulling him closer. Nick's obsession was tightening like a trap. Victor's strategy was sharpening into a weapon, And the new year was approaching with the kind of cruel timing Genoa City loved. When fireworks and champagne would distract the world while the real explosions happened in the dark. The most terrifying possibility was not that Sienna was pregnant, or that Matt would choose to believe her, but that the pregnancy would become the final catalyst. The moment Matt stopped thinking like a fugitive bargaining for money and started thinking like a madman writing an ending. An ending where one life was not enough payment for the humiliation he felt, and where Noah Newman, the man Sienna waited for, could become the next name on his list simply because Matt could not stand the idea that someone else would get a future he believed he was owed. Matt Clark chose the moment of revelation with the same instinct for spectacle that had defined every step of his downfall, delivering the alleged DNA results not as a private disclosure, but as a calculated detonation designed to ripple through the Newman family with maximum force. The announcement arrived wrapped in smug certainty, accompanied by documentation that appeared airtight on the surface, declaring him the biological father of Sienna's unborn child. To Matt, this was not merely proof but a coronation, a way to reassert dominance by embedding himself permanently into the Newman narrative, ensuring that even in exile or disgrace, his name would be spoken alongside theirs. The impact was immediate and violent in its emotional reach, a shockwave that tore through assumptions, loyalties, and fragile hopes that had barely survived the kidnapping itself. Yet for all its dramatic weight, the claim landed unevenly within the family because Victor and Nikki, seasoned by decades of manipulation, power plays, and forged truths, did not react with awe or surrender, but with cold, instinctive suspicion. Victor's gaze sharpened rather than softened, his mind already dissecting timelines, motivations, and the improbability of a man like Matt Clark suddenly becoming a paragon of biological truth. While Nikki felt the familiar chill of a lie that was too convenient, too neatly packaged to be trusted. To them, the results felt less like an answer and more like a move, another gambit in a game Matt was desperate not to lose. For Noah, however, the announcement did not register as strategy or deception, but as devastation. The idea that Sienna could have betrayed him in the most intimate, irreversible way shattered his sense of reality, collapsing love into humiliation and hope into self-doubt. He replayed every memory, every promise, every moment of closeness, searching for signs he had missed, and the absence of clarity became its own form of torture. The pain was not just romantic but existential, because believing Matt meant accepting that his role in Sienna's life had been an illusion, that he had been fighting for someone who had already chosen another path. While Noah spiraled inward, Sienna's world darkened in a different way, as the lie she had constructed for survival metastasized into a public condemnation she could no longer control. She watched the damage unfold with a hollow ache, guilt and fear coiling together until she could barely breathe, knowing that every second she remained silent deepened the wound she had inflicted on the one person who had never stopped believing in her. The weight became unbearable, not because the lie was clever or sustainable, but because it was rooted in terror rather than ambition. When Sienna finally reached her breaking point, the confession did not come as a dramatic reversal, but as a collapse. A surrender to truth after realizing that silence was destroying more than honesty ever could. She told Noah everything, not sparing herself, not softening the cruelty of her choices, explaining that the DNA results were fabricated. A tool Matt had wielded with precision after uncovering a dark chapter from her past she had spent years trying to bury. That secret, whatever its details, had been enough to give Matt absolute leverage, because exposure would not only have ruined her but endangered Noah, and Matt had made that threat explicit, promising harm to Noah if she refused to play her part. Claiming Matt as the father had not been a betrayal of love but a desperate calculation, a shield she had hoped would keep Noah alive long enough for the nightmare to end. Speaking the truth cost her everything she had left emotionally, because she knew that confession did not guarantee forgiveness, only clarity. Noah's response was fractured and human, a collision of anger, relief, and renewed determination that left him raw but resolute. The hurt did not vanish simply because the lie was explained. but it transformed, redirecting itself away from Sienna and toward the man who had engineered their suffering. Noah understood now that Sienna's silence had been an act of coercion rather than deceit, and that realization reignited his instinct to protect rather than retreat. He chose not to let Matt define their story, deciding instead that survival would require exposure, not endurance, and that love, however damaged, could still be a weapon if wielded with honesty. That choice marked a turning point not just for Noah but for the entire Newman family, because his resolve aligned with Victor's long-simmering skepticism, converting doubt into action. As the truth filtered through the family, suspicion hardened into purpose, and what had once been a defensive posture evolved into a coordinated effort to dismantle Matt's narrative piece by piece. Victor moved with familiar efficiency, mobilizing resources, reopening timelines, and scrutinizing the alleged DNA chain of custody with the cold patience of someone who had seen empires fall over less convincing lies. Nikki, equally attuned to the emotional undercurrents, supported Noah and Sienna in quieter ways, understanding that truth alone was not enough. That proof would have to be undeniable to counter Matt's audacity. The family closed ranks, not out of blind loyalty but out of shared recognition that Matt Clark's greatest weapon had always been isolation, turning individuals against one another until Dak did his work for him. Now, that isolation was cracking, replaced by collective resolve. Noah became an active participant rather than a bystander, pushing past his pain to help trace inconsistencies, question procedures, and identify who had facilitated the falsified results. Because a lie of that magnitude rarely existed without accomplices. Sienna, though emotionally fragile, contributed what she could, recounting every threat, every implication Matt had made, even when doing so forced her to relive moments she would have rather erased. Each detail added texture to the case against him, transforming her from a pawn into a witness, and that shift alone threatened Matt's carefully constructed persona. The investigation was no longer about reclaiming dignity, but about dismantling a man who believed fear could permanently replace truth. As plans took shape, the family understood that exposing Matt would not be a single dramatic reveal but a methodical unweaving, requiring patience and restraint, qualities that did not come easily to people accustomed to decisive victories. Yet this time, the stakes demanded precision because Matt's instability made him unpredictable, and cornering him too quickly could provoke the very violence they were trying to prevent. The strategy became clear. Gather evidence quietly, corroborate Sienna's account, challenge the DNA results through independent channels, and prepare for a confrontation that would leave no room for reinterpretation or escape. In this shared effort, old divisions softened, replaced by the rare alignment of purpose that only emerges when a threat is both external and deeply personal. What none of them could ignore, however, was the emotional cost already paid, the scars left by lies told under duress and truths revealed too late. Noah and Sienna stood at the center of that damage, trying to rebuild trust in a landscape where every promise had been weaponized. Their future remained uncertain, not because love was absent, but because it had been tested in ways that left permanent marks. Still, as the Newman family moved forward together, the balance of power shifted subtly but unmistakably. Away from Matt Clark and toward the truth he had tried to bury under forged results and theatrical bravado. The coming confrontation promised to be decisive, not just for the fate of a child whose paternity had been turned into a battlefield, but for the principle that no amount of manipulation could indefinitely outpace collective resolve. In choosing to investigate rather than react, to expose rather than intimidate, the Newmans set the stage for a reckoning that would determine whether Matt's final legacy would be one of control or collapse, and whether survival built on lies could ever withstand the weight of truth once it finally refused to stay silent.